The U.S. and Israel meet on Iran. Joe Biden's national security advisor travels to Jerusalem, hoping to devise a common strategy on Tehran. As negotiators prepare for a new round of talks in Vienna, will the U.S. and Israel decide the fate of the Jcpoa? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Israel's behind-the-scenes role in nuclear talks. With the Vienna talks noting very little progress, Israel continues to push Washington to protect its own interests at the table. And the U.S. is, at least, listening closely. National Security Advisor Sullivan visited Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who's called for the negotiations with Iran to be halted, accusing the country of nuclear blackmail.
These days are pretty important. What happens in Vienna has profound ramifications for the stability of the Middle East and the security of Israel for the upcoming years, and that's why it's such a timely meeting.
Well, the Israeli government, first under Benjamin Netanyahu and now under Bennett, remains firmly opposed to ongoing international efforts to revive the Jcpoa. The 2015 accord saw Iran agree to curb its nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Israel says any new agreement must make improvements from an Israeli perspective over the original deal, and that the U.S. must be prepared to use military force against Iran if necessary. Israel considers Iran its regional archenemy and says it will take any steps needed to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. Now, Iran insists its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes.
At a critical juncture for both of our countries on a major set of security issues, it's important that we sit together and develop a common strategy, a common outlook, and find a way forward that fundamentally secures your country's interests and mine.
Well, Israeli officials spoke to U.S. news outlet Axios following the meeting and said Sullivan reassured them that the U.S. is prepared to take a tougher stance on Iran. He reportedly outlined three possible scenarios. Either they sign a new nuclear accord within the next few weeks, returning all parties to full compliance with the 2015 deal, or a so-called freeze-for-freeze agreement, which would stop Iran from making any further progress in its nuclear program. Or no deal would be signed and new sanctions would be imposed on Iran. Now, the original deal, of course, unraveled when former President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew in 2018 and reimposed sanctions on Iran. Since then, Iran has resumed enriching uranium beyond the limits set under the deal. And now the Biden administration is warning it may soon be too late to revive it.
It really depends on the pace of their nuclear process. If they halt the nuclear advances, we have more time. If they continue at their current pace, we have some weeks left, but not much more than that, at which point the conclusion will be there's no deal to be revived.
So, will Naftali Bennett get what he wants from Biden? And is Israel really trying to drag the U.S. toward conflict with Iran? Well, to discuss that, let's cross to our panel. And here with me in the studio is journalist Borzou Daragahi. He is an international correspondent for The Independent and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Scott Lucas joins us from Birmingham, UK. He's a politics professor at the University of Birmingham, as well as a U.S. foreign policy analyst with a special focus on Iran. And from Tel Aviv is journalist Neri Zilber. He's also an adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute and an advisor to the Israel Policy Forum. Thanks all so much for being with us. Neri, I'm going to start with you because I first want to understand what the state of play is inside Israel. Can it be said that the unanimous train of thought is that negotiating with Iran, the Jcpoa, can only be a bad thing for Israelis? Or are there camps within the government that want to see a revival of that accord and be, less antagonistic in their approach to Tehran altogether?
Right. I think that's a good way to put it. Different camps within the Israeli government that might have differing opinions about a possible return to the original nuclear deal, the Jcpoa. But having said that, it's important to note that at least publicly and outwardly, the Israeli government, the current Israeli government led by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, are closing ranks and at least projecting a united front and united message primarily to Washington that they want a harder line being taken in Vienna during the talks, a better deal to come out of those talks, and barring that, more pressure applied on Iran, primarily economic and potentially military.
Is that, is the general consensus that that's what's good for Israel, or are there fears that that could backfire?
Well, I think the new Israeli government is unanimous in its position that a closer coordination mechanism and less antagonism towards Washington is a better thing for Israel. And this is in sharp contrast, we should highlight, to prior policies put forward by Benjamin Netanyahu when he was prime minister for the past 12 years. But in terms of any potential deal coming out of the talks, I think privately Israel would be very happy if the nuclear crisis was somehow resolved and that it was taken off the table at least for the coming few years, but not at any cost. And that Israel would like to see a harder line, like I mentioned, by Washington and the other world powers in Vienna, not a complete capitulation to Iranian demands and any potential future Iranian nuclear program.
Okay, fair enough. Borzou, Vienna talks are going to resume on Monday, with those involved saying there's just no time to waste. But with so little progress really made so far, how determined do they have to be then at this point to get something done, especially given the talks now directly between Israel and the United States pushing for this very hard line?
Well, I mean, the Iranians have their bargaining position. I think that there are factions also within Iran, some that are more amenable to a restoration of the deal as it was, and some who say that, no, we want more. And we want guarantees, and this is the sort of sticking block at this point. We want guarantees that the same thing that happened before, the Americans and the Iranians and the Europeans agreeing to a deal, and then at one point, the U.S. Sabotaging that deal without any cost to itself never happens again. And in a way, what you see as a sort of Iranian escalation of its nuclear program over the last year or so, year and a half at this point, with increasing enrichment of uranium, use of more efficient centrifuges to produce that uranium. In a way, what they're trying to do is tell the Americans, send a message, this is the cost. This is the price you pay for getting out of the deal. Right now, the deal doesn't have any penalties for anyone who. It turns out to be one of the flaws of the deal is that there is, from the Iranian point of view at least, is if they withdraw from the deal, they get all these penalties and sanctions. But the Americans were able to do this without any cost, and so in a way, what you're seeing now is, making the Americans pay for what the Trump administration did. Okay,
Scott, would you agree there? This is about making the Americans pay for what Trump devised in derailing this process?
I'd go even farther. I think both with what Neri and what Borzou have said, and that is you've got two issues here. One is, you have to be honest, Donald Trump ripped up the deal that was in place. Whether or not you think it was a good deal or whether or not you think it was a flawed deal, there was nothing left, at least with regards to U.S. participation. And he pursued a policy of maximum pressure, which hasn't worked. It's only isolated the U.S. The second problem is that having ripped everything up, there's no chance it's going to be put back together in the near future. And here that's because of the Iranians. The fact of the matter is that this is a much different government. It's a much tougher line under President Raisi rather than under President Rouhani. And that the Iranian tactics were, first of all, to delay on coming back to the talks for 5 months. And then when they did come back in Vienna, to undo the progress which was made between April and June. The progress made regarding sanctions, regarding U.S. reentry, regarding Iranian compliance with the deal. And we're almost at the point where the Iranians are basically setting a precondition, which is, as Borzou indicated, that the Americans will have to lift some sanctions. The Americans will have to, in effect, pull back from the position under the Trump administration before there will be any Iranian move over the details of a nuclear agreement.
Scott, at this point, do you think China, France, Germany, Russia, Britain, and Iran worried truly about the U.S. and Israel actually making their job impossible in Vienna?
I think that there's a lot of worry which goes around because we quite often talk about the US and Iran, and we quite often forget that in addition to Israel watching from the side, that you've got the European powers, you've got the Chinese, you've got the Russians, who still are in an agreement which still is in place, even if it's been weakened. And we know that the European powers, as well as the United States, the Europeans aren't just simply puppets of the US, they're very worried about Iranian compliance. They're very worried about Iran ratcheting up the enrichment program and suspending cooperation with the IAEA over inspections. And China and Russia, to a degree, are also worried about that Iranian tough line, which threatens to break the deal entirely. Now, China and Russia will not be as hard publicly against Tehran as the European powers will be, but yeah, they are concerned. And so right now, they're sort of caught in the middle, which is they want the talks to continue. At the other hand, if they put themselves too firmly publicly in the US-European camp, they risk burning their bridges with Tehran, which they want not only for the nuclear deal, but for leverage in, well, everywhere from Central Asia to the Middle East.
Okay. Neri, let me ask you, for those in Israel who do not want to see any deal with Iran, tell us more about why. I mean, is it to try to ensure that Iran would not be able to fight back, per se, should Israel feel the need to attack?
Well, you're right in the sense that there are still hardliners in Israel, whether in government or outside of government, former officials who want a harder line taken on Iran, who don't believe any deal or any diplomacy will actually constrain Iran, whether on nuclear issues or missiles or regional proxies and arming various militias all across the Middle East. So they're still taking a very hard line, despite the fact that reality over the past 3 years, after Trump withdrew from the original deal, has shown that their hardline policy has not actually brought any tangible benefits in terms of change in Iranian behavior. Quite the opposite, especially on the nuclear program, which has just raced ahead. But in terms of what they want to see, they want to see more pressure. They still believe, for whatever reason, that additional economic pressure combined with a credible military threat will actually bring Iran back to the table to negotiate an even better and longer and stronger deal in their minds, or perhaps even further, will actually bring the Iranian regime to its knees. I think that's what they want to see happen and what they believe will happen if their hardline policy is maintained and continued.
Okay. Borzou, here's one of the issues here. We've said before that, you know, it would just be ludicrous for Iran to actually develop a nuclear weapon, much yet less use it, because it would actually ensure its own destruction. If Iran were to use any weapons on it, there'd be a massive attack from Israel and the United States that would really just destroy Iran entirely. They're up against the world, really, in that sense. So the concern then is this process actually with Israel and the United States is pushing Iran further into developing its nuclear program so that that weapon could be developed?
I mean, that's what they want to be. I think that is the Iranian consensus. That there are some people who say we should try to get a nuclear weapon in the establishment. There are some people who said we should never try to get it. There are some people who say, and this is becoming the emerging consensus, that we should try to become a threshold state. Where we have all of the parts and know-how to make a nuclear weapon if we need to, but we don't actually take that final step unless we are absolutely forced to. But look, I mean, I think the disaster for the Trump administration and for the Israeli hawks and the pro-Israeli hawks is that they tried to bring Iran to its knees with the maximum pressure program. In addition to that, there was like assassination and sabotage campaigns against Iranian defense and nuclear facilities and so on. There was the pandemic that devastated the country. Iran was the most hard hit, and despite all of that, Iran came out okay. I mean, not great. Their economy is in bad shape, but whose is in good shape? And that's where the Iranian establishment right now feels very emboldened and very encouraged to take on maximalist positions when it comes to both the nuclear deal and other stuff such as its missiles program and its deployment of armed groups throughout the Middle East.
Right. Borzou, how much do you think the Biden administration is really actually beholden to Israel, and why? And I mean, why has the Biden administration strayed so far from what the Obama administration wanted to achieve?
I don't think that they're beholden to Israel. I don't buy that. I think that there is a pro-Israeli constituency in Congress and the Senate and within the Democratic Party, which is becoming weaker, actually. I think that they want to keep Israel on side, definitely. I think Biden is very pro-Israel in his outlook, it has been for many decades. I don't think that I think that they are of the Democratic Party kind of faction that genuinely believes that a limit on that the JCPOA would actually benefit Israel's security and would be good for Israel. And there are many pro-Israel members of Congress and the Senate who also agree with that position.
Okay. Scott Lucas, I want you to comment on the same question there and also take it a step further and tell me in what case you think the U.S. might ever actually use force against Iran if it were pushed. I mean, especially with people talking about Trump being reelected potentially in 2024.
Oh, I don't want to go down the road of Trump 2024 for many reasons, but I don't think we're talking about U.S. going in with force alongside Israel or on its own preemptively for a military confrontation. I think instead what the prospect is, and we've heard reference to it, is that if there is no deal, that the pressure will be ratcheted up, not in the sense of the Trump maximum pressure campaign, because that was incoherent, really had no idea where it was going, but I think just simply an escalation of the Israeli tactics, which Neri pointed out, which are the assassinations, which are the cyber warfare, which are the sabotage, which have had a toll on Iranian infrastructure. I think the Americans will step up the economic sanctions. I think they'll do so not again the way that Trump did it, with just, here it is, we're sanctioning everything, but they'll sort of target various aspects of the Iranian leadership and of the Iranian economy. Now, where that goes, and the problem that Borzou and Neri have identified is you don't know what the endpoint is. Because I would slightly sort of disagree with Borzou on this, and that is, I don't think the Iranians have come out stronger out of the last 3 years. I think what you're seeing right now is a very hardline administration backed by the supreme leader thumping its chest to cover up weakness. The fact of the matter is that the Iranian leadership, President Raisi, only took power because of a managed election. It was the lowest participation in a presidential election in the history of the Islamic Republic. The economy is not just damaged, it is arguably in some aspects in a critical situation. And you've got a Raisi government that's trying to cover all of that up, and a Revolutionary Guards are trying to cover all of it up by every day saying, look at our offensive capability. The problem again, is that does not mean, and I have to emphasize this, that this means that you're going to see a return to the mass protest in 2009 that I think were a challenge to the Iranian regime. You're not going to see the Iranians overthrow the system because basically people are resigned and people are tired. So again, I kick it back to Neri and Borzou. In that case, where does an Israeli-U.S. policy go in terms not of tactics, but of as it were, an exit strategy? Where do you want to wind up? Not only on Iran, but on all the Middle Eastern questions we could talk about, from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq to Saudi Arabia to Israel-Palestine.
Okay, Neri, go ahead. I want to hear your thoughts on what you just heard, and then I'd like to get Borzou's as well. Go ahead.
Right. So a few things. I don't think it's accurate to say that the U.S. is beholden to Israel in terms of Iran policy. The U.S. will do what it's in its own national interest. We saw that under President Obama, where despite Benjamin Netanyahu's strong opposition to an Iran deal, Obama went ahead and did that. And I think Biden, we should remember, Israel is not a party to the nuclear agreement. So if anything, the U.S. is negotiating with the other European powers, with Russia, China, to find some way forward vis-a-vis the Iran talks. But where the Biden administration is trying to get closer to Israel is in terms of coordination, as Borzou said, to keep Israel on side. And also, and this isn't a minor point, in terms of the strategic optics of the Vienna talks, to have Israel play the bad cop role in terms of the possible consequences that may befall Iran if the talks do not succeed. So I think in that sense, Israel has a role to play. And in terms of the prospects of any renewed deal, I think the other guest put it very correctly. It's up to Iran to decide whether it really wants to negotiate in earnest. And if the U.S. were to find itself nearing any kind of red line, that would be due to Iranian behavior and escalation.
Right. And Neri, just quickly, I mean, if you don't want to describe it, understandably as being beholden to Israeli interests, I guess what has shocked so many Americans over the course of Biden's term in office is his going astray from what Obama, and he was vice president, of course, under that administration, hoped to achieve by bringing Iran back into the fore as an international partner of sorts. What is the thought in Israel then? Because there is always fear a little bit when a left-leaning administration comes into power in the U.S. that it won't be pro-Israel enough. That certainly has not been the case with Biden.
No, I think President Biden, even on a deep personal level, is very pro-Israel. He's been a politician for many decades, and that has been his consistent policy, despite where the Democratic Party may be heading to. I think that's oftentimes overstated. But I don't think it's quite fair to say that Biden isn't trying to return to where Obama was or didn't make a good faith effort to return to the Jcpoa. That was a stated policy of the Biden administration going into office. They waited several long months for the Iranians to hold their own election and to come back to the table. And then once they returned to the table just a few weeks ago, the U.S., along with most of the other world powers, said the Iranian offer just wasn't serious. So I think the Biden administration finds itself right now at a state where they're waiting for a genuine engagement on the part of Tehran.
Okay. Borzou, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think that, part of the problem is that, I think that the Biden administration does want to go back to the deal, but and to some extent, Iran wants to go back to a deal. But the problem is that the ground has shifted over the last 4 years, and reality has changed. One thing is that Iran's nuclear know-how has grown, and this is something that you can't dismantle or even bomb. So there's a certain reality on the ground. And there's another factor from the Iranian point of view is that, the experience of the Trump administration has given them a lesson that, basically U.S. politics could change and, then the deal becomes worthless. Right. If you're Iran, I mean, just think about this. If you're Iran, you've, got all these like parts of a nuclear program, you go back into a deal, and you give up all of this stuff that you wanted that gives you prestige, or you think it gives you prestige and power. And then all of a sudden there's an election, and any Republican under the kind of MAGA, Make America Great Again and Trumpian kind of rubric, any Republican will immediately tear up that deal. So why would you? I mean, think about it. Why would you go back into the deal? Right. What is the incentive there?
I mean, we're back to the question we've asked a million times. When does it actually hit that proverbial point of no return, when the uranium and the knowledge simply reach a point where a weapon can be built and you can't take that back?
Then some say it's already there.
Okay, so what is Iran really negotiating with? What leverage does it have if it's already there?
I mean, they already have, some say that they already have the capability, they have the design and the technological capability to build a bomb if they really need to. What they're negotiating is access by inspectors, dismantling of stockpiles, or at least knowable stockpiles, and that's another issue. What if there's sort of undeclared sites and so on? And on the other side, there's the issue of sanctions, and then there's sanctions upon sanctions upon sanctions that have to be removed or at least addressed. And in the sort of Trump administration, during the Trump administration, they put backup sanctions. So they would sanction the same thing under the nuclear program, and then they would sanction it under human rights violations. So was that a genuine sanction? Was it a real necessary sanction, and so on. So there's all sorts of complicated things to unravel on both sides.
Right. I just feel I have to mention, because as we were talking about the Biden administration being very pro-Israel in a way that the Obama administration was not perceived to be, Scott Lucas, one final point, taking a bit of a tangent here, but still related. We just saw Anthony Blinken actually visit Indonesia, looking to get, the world's most populous Muslim country to recognize the state of Israel. There was talk about that. I mean, how do you see all of this kind of folding in when we talk about America's current very pro-Israeli policy and how it leaves Iran feeling now very kind of further isolated at the negotiating table?
I actually would put it slightly differently. I understand why we talk about pro-Israeli, but I think you'd look at it in terms of the Biden administration trying to rescue a U.S. regional policy. There's also an Asian dimension here, by the way. The Indonesians were not happy with the U.S., UK, Australia nuclear submarine deal. But reflecting this back on the Middle East, the point about the Obama administration is that it did not have a coherent regional approach once you got beyond the nuclear issue in so many ways. Its Israel-Palestine negotiating strategy collapsed after the end of year one, and they could never rebuild it. In Syria, its indecision was disastrous, where in effect they got pushed aside by the Russians in many respects, pretty much are linked up with the Kurds in part of Syria, but are watching the Iranians and the Russians maneuver elsewhere. In Iraq, they were facing a question of maneuvering versus Iran that they could not solve in terms of getting political influence. And of course, there's the Yemen disaster, a disaster involving not only the Iranians, but America's allies, or sometimes allies, the Saudis. Now, that Obama administration, in other words, by 2017, I think was in disarray in the region. And of course, Donald Trump simply took disarray and just threw all the pieces of the Middle East up in the air. One of those pieces was the nuclear deal. But it's only one of those pieces. Even if you get the nuclear deal, all the other pieces, stretching from Palestine to Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen and back to Syria again, can even throw Libya into the mix, they're still in play.
Scott Lucas, I will have to give you the final word. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. Neri Zilber and Borzou Daragahi, thanks all so much for being with us. And to our viewers, of course, as well, remember you can follow us on Twitter at @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.